Um, Abby Weaver, who is a teacher of the deaf here in Southeast Ohio, is going to present today on accommodations or modifications. So Abby, go ahead and take it away.
First off, accommodations or modifications, I will say it's probably one of the biggest challenges in the school because a lot of educators as well sometimes get confused about accommodations or modifications. And it does take a lot of judgment call on which one's the right one because not one size fits all. So it really is kind of an art. And I am a teacher for the deaf and hard of hearing. I am an itinerant teacher that basically works around 5 counties. And I'm also deaf myself. So I'm coming from this from a few different perspectives. One, a teacher for the deaf and hard of hearing, and also a consumer of accommodations and modifications in the work environment, in the school environment. Really, accommodations, modifications happen everywhere. And this drawing that you see was done by one of my students, and that's me wearing the Roger FM and my blue hearing aids. So it really is just important to kind of be aware of what we're showing our students because they really are picking up on messages that we're putting out there about accommodations and modifications. And I want to thank Tabitha and Abby for inviting me to do today's webinar on my lunch break. So thank you for having me. And then let's move on to the next slide. And this workshop webinar, it's being done in spoken English. So if you guys have any accommodation needs that I'm not aware of, just reach out and let us know that you want it in sign language or both or any other issues such as vision. If you'll note the clip art and pictures, I haven't included a description in text of those representations of clip art and pictures, and you'll note that later on in the webinar. So that's just another subtle accommodation that I've already put into the presentation to make it accessible. And then we'll move on to the next slide. All right, in summary, modification. This is a change to how one is being instructed. It changes the core of what's being taught, such as you may be reading on a different reading level. So you're in a 5th grade classroom. I might be giving you a reading passage on your ability level, which may be 3rd grade. I may be doing a graphic novel instead of Hamlet and plain old tedious English. You're going to have a graphic novel to support you. Or a 5-page essay. It's going to be shortened to a 1-page essay. Or the list goes on and on. So you're changing fundamentally what is being asked of you and what's being taught. For accommodation, this is just changing how you access information. So for a deaf and hard of hearing learner, this may be an interpreter for the deaf and hard of hearing, a language facilitator, or captioning, or even the printed word for access or a personal FM system. So you're getting the exact same information, just repackaged a little bit differently. Modification, you're changing where the vehicle's going, what you're learning, what road you're on. So think of it that way. And we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, first thing that's really important, regardless of your age, in school, out of school, in the work environment, what playbook or playbooks are you playing by? You have several different laws coming into play, and that can really impact the accommodation or a modification that you're asking or can be asked for. In some situations, you may have 3 laws in play, and how you get that accommodation and how you ask for it can vary. So it's just really important to know, oh, I'm on a school field trip going to the theater in the next town over. I'm going to be asking for an interpreter under Americans with Disability Act. But for the bus ride and when we get back to the school and we're talking about the play, I'm going to be using an interpreter underneath Individuals with Disability Education Improvement Act, IDEIA, or as many of us think of it, your IEP that gives you that interpreter. So multiple laws can come into play, and that's even deaf adults that are my friends, they sometimes struggle with, is it under 504 or ADA? How do I go about asking for an accommodation? So I would really stress that starts young and get your children familiar with that lingo. And Tabitha, if we could go on to the next slide, please. Where does it need to happen? And this is just food for thought, and just something that I find really important. If an accommodation or a modification is needed at school, it might be needed elsewhere in the world. So if you're using a personal FM system at school, you might need one when you're on the basketball team, if you're a religious family, when you're at church. or even at the family dinner table. Asking for accommodation, modeling this is a lifelong skill, and it shows acceptance of an individual with disabilities. So watching my mom ask for accommodations growing up, she, by modeling that, taught me how later as a young woman in college and now in work, how to ask for accommodations, because there's a right way and a wrong way to do it for both accommodations or modifications. And also, just another thing to share, a lot of times people say, well, they're only 5. Having that personal FM system at 5 is just as important as having it at 36, or that interpreter at 5 at the doctor's office, just as important at 35, because this is how you learn how to navigate different aspects of the world. And I always call it listening to your parent on the phone, navigating, the court, the hospital, doctor office, credit card company. That's really important. It starts not when you're 18. Tabitha, if we could have the next slide, please. Okay, so this is kind of what I talked about before. Accommodation, you're going to the same place. It just changes how you get there, how you access information in the classroom or other environments with assistance, but it doesn't change the nature of what you're learning. You're still learning Romeo and Juliet, regardless if you use an interpreter, a sound field, a personal FM system, if you're using captioning or printed notes. This is not changing anything. It doesn't take away anything really from the lesson or the learning. And so sometimes people will say, if you do this, it's a crutch. Is it a crutch or is it a tool? Because sometimes I hear people say that, well, you're given an unfair access. No, we're leveling the playing field. We're given access, period. That's what it's about. Fairness for me may be different for you because you may have different needs. And that is not just a special education thing. That's just we're all different and we have different strengths and weaknesses. Tabitha, if we could have the next slide. Modification. This is where it does get a little trickier because this is changing how you're taught and what you've learned. So an example may be instead of reading about, the water cycle, I might have you watch a video on the water cycle because you're a more visual learner and you're going to process that information better, or you need to do that before you even tackle reading about the water cycle. Or even just giving you a different book because this book is not accessible to you. You're not ready to understand the water cycle. You don't even know how water is. You don't know that this liquid is called water or that's called liquid and it changes stages. So again, modification, it does change things and you really have to think about, am I building to a skill? So I might be using that flat screen TV or that tablet to build the language before we get into reading and writing. Or even, we're playing with water and talking about water before I expect you to kind of have a rich vocabulary foundation. Tabitha, if we could have the next slide. Classroom instruction. Modification. Classroom assignment is modified or changed. And this is where I keep talking about the length, the level, or the complexity. A project that's based on a rubric may be modified based on, your child, the student's needs. Instead of being required to write a 5-page essay that's going to take you 2 weeks and many, many evenings, it may be better and you may learn more by doing a 1-page essay or doing a poster or a PowerPoint or a presentation or even a little video clip where you talk about it. Because at the end of the day, we want you to have learned and not be so bogged down. Whose paper is it really at the end if you're expected to do a 5-page essay and I'm really, really helping you along with so much help that it's not completely your ownership anymore. So that's where modifications come in handy. It is your work. We've made it to where you can access it and you can do it. Accommodation. This may be an example of preferential seating. Being able to have a seat, and oops for the typo there, sorry, having a seat in a location that's best for, I'm going to stress this, both visual and auditory access. And it may not always be the front row. Having my better ear towards the presenter or making sure I'm not by something that's blocking the view, such as a pillar in the room. Closed captions, subtitles for classroom media, that can be really critical. That's a very easy accommodation to do. You're not changing anything. An example may be for a modification, that video that we love, it's so old and ancient, there is no caption or subtitle. You may want to find a different video on the same topic that is accessible with captioning and subtitles. So that's kind of a double duty there. That's a mixture of both, and that's why people get confused sometimes. An accommodation is a personal FM system or a sound field to assist with auditory access. This is giving you the best listening environment possible to use your residual hearing that you have. So you're kind of cutting out all the clutter that goes on in a classroom environment because it is really noisy. And the more you listen, either with your eyes or ears, the better access you have, the better you're going to learn. Tabitha, if you can do the next slide. We're not going to watch the video today, so I encourage you to go back. I did include a captioned version of the video. And again, that's just another accommodation that I've built in. But this is a fabulous YouTube simulation of what it sounds like through a hearing aid and a personal FM system, which is a common school accommodation. And I will warn you, most people get sound fields and personal FM systems mixed up or confused. So there'll be another slide down the road that shows you what sound fields are, and in that I've included a sound field video as well. But just to clear up some of the confusion and why there's so much confusion, the personal FM system, think of a personal as the person with the hearing aids that have the personal FM receivers connected. They're the only ones that can hear what is going through that microphone. A sound field, that is amplifying the voice above all the chatter in the classroom, so that way everyone gets the benefit of that technology. And that is great for any learner, and that you don't have to have a hearing loss to benefit from that. So the child in the back row hears just as well as the child in the front row, and that really does impact learning. So again, sound field, everyone in the classroom gets the benefit of that. Personal FM, it's just for the person with the personal FM. And you can see right here, the teacher has the microphone on, and there's a speaker. So every child, regardless of where they're sitting, can hear the teacher with great clarity, such as the child in the pink shirt. Her back is to the teacher. So if that child was wearing hearing aids, right there, you're not going to hear as well because your hearing aids are designed to pick up sound in front of you. But she might need to be looking at her partners, but the sound field can help with that, and a personal FM system is even better. So we'll go on to the next slide. Classroom tests. This is where a lot of issues have happened over the years. So it's really good to have this dialogue before you get into a situation where you have a test, and especially high-stakes tests. So reading a class in a book, reading a book in class, this might change what you read, when you read, what's the timeline. I want you to, a modification might be you get 2 extra weeks to tackle this book because you read at a slower rate. This is a great modification. You're taking off some of that stress. A spelling test. Another modification there is to reduce the spelling list so you can really learn what you're learning instead of, all right, I've learned 10 words, but I'm not going to remember it next week. That's not real learning. Or extended time. So instead of you give me 10 words every week, I'm going to get one list for 2 weeks. So again, I really learn what does that word mean? How do I spell it? How do I sound it out? How do I use it? And then also, a lot of people don't think about this. When you use sign language, finger spelling is also important. There's a big component that connects finger spelling to literacy. So for a little kiddo who is just now learning, about spelling, I might have the interpreter finger spell the spelling word, so that way he gets, or she, that this is a word. You need to catch it and you need to write it down. It's connected to print. And when you finger spell, you may not see every single letter, but you're still responsible for knowing the whole word because you've been exposed to it for a certain amount of time. An accommodation, and this is not related to the spelling test, it can be text-to-speech or perhaps a signed version of the text. I've done that with different passages for students where I just videotaped myself, put it on a private channel, and that way the student could see me signing the passage and really help with the comprehension. And going back to spelling tests, this is allowing the use of lip reading, visual phonics, which is hand cues, the use of a personal FM system or sound field, or just a simple accommodation is being given a little bit extra time to process the word and spelling. So I'm not talking about the 2-week scenario I did before, but just another minute to really process what is the teacher asking me, or to slow it down. So now I'm watching the teacher's face, now I'm looking at the page, and they're not going to move on until I look back up. Or I watched the teacher, then I watch the interpreter, then I look at the page, because you have a lot of split focus going on in classrooms where you're juggling 3 different balls. You're looking at the teacher, the board, the page, the interpreter, trying to lip read. There's a lot of visual demands on a student with a hearing loss. And with standardized assessments, and this is in green at the bottom, or even state tests, the accommodations that are allowed and the modifications that are allowed vary quite a bit. So you really need to do your homework. Each test has different rules on what is and is not allowed. And you should also give the kids time to get used to what is allowed, what isn't allowed. And ideally, what you're doing from an accommodations and modification standpoint, it should be happening day in, day out in the classroom or even at home. So that way when you're given the test, it's not, whoa, I've never used this calculator before. I don't know how to do this. And now you've flustered the child even more. If we go to the next slide. Okay, this is a big one. Human reader. And I've started adding this to documents recently because so many people want speech to text. But in some cases, the quality of the recording for the speech to text is not quite there. And also, you can't lip read a machine. And a familiar voice that you know is generally better than a recorded voice. You just need to make sure to have some kind of discussion with your IEP team and your child or your student so that way you know what works best. I've seen some kids shut down when you give them a recorded voice, but when you give them a human voice, they do much better. Also, depending on the software, can you change the gender or the pacing, the rate of speech, or the volume of the reader speech-to-text generated voice? This is critical, and I will also share right now. Headphones, they're generally not a good idea if you have a hearing loss. You really want to connect to your listening device via a patch cord, and we'll talk more about that later, but just I wanted to share that right now. Headphones are usually not a good idea for that speech-to-text, or text-to-speech, I'm sorry. And let's go to the next slide. All right, subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing. This is different than just subtitles. Even my family, they'll ask me the difference about this. So just real quick, subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing, or sometimes you'll see hearing impaired. And this is where you're going to see in the subtitles footsteps behind the person that's walking, or the door slam, or scary music, or romantic music, birds chirping. Those little subtle cues that tell you, oh, this is a loving moment in the movie or a scary moment in the movie. That's really critical. And when you're looking at the back of a DVD, if you're looking at a DVD, you can see if there's subtitles there or closed caption. Now, I will tell you, most people don't realize that some projectors do come with a closed caption chip. So if you're friends with a school technology person, remind them when they go to replace the projectors in the building, maybe they want to look at one that does have a closed caption chip. So if that old VHS tape or that DVD that doesn't have subtitles but has closed caption, that will be accessible in the classroom, because it's not required to have both closed caption and subtitles, so that you're running into that a lot in the classroom where you've got a new DVD, but it's only closed caption, but there's no TVs in the classroom anymore. Or even if you're just looking at a tablet or a netbook, how are you going to make that media accessible? And I also want to give you a word of caution. Look at the clarity and the accuracy of the closed caption or subtitles. Some are machine generated, which means they may or may not be accurate, as the computer may hear dear the animal or dear, like dear Abby, etc. So really watch out for machine generated subtitles or captions. And then Tabitha, if we could have the next slide. All right, Netflix. Netflix was sued back in 2010, and there's an agreement where they would have 100% of subtitles by 2014. And the reason why I'm taking time to talk about Netflix, Amazon, and other streaming sources, teachers or other individuals may not realize that all you have to do is click one button, and now that media is accessible for your student or child. That comes with a caveat, though. It's good to develop literacy and reading skills, but don't say that, and I just like to pick on Shakespeare a lot, you're going to now have a student watch Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare. They may be on a lower reading level. Now you have unfamiliar words and phrases going at a rapid pace. So they may still need an interpreter, and they may need to watch that footage more than once because of that split focus I was talking about before. Am I watching the movie and I'm reading the caption? Now I'm looking at the interpreter so I know what he really meant in Romeo and Juliet. So there's a lot of work that goes involved with media in most cases. Tabitha, if we could have the next slide. Tabby? Thank you. This is another one. So Netflix, a lot of teachers use their personal accounts. That way they can show a favorite movie. This is by the federal government. This is described caption media program. I call this an educational version of a streaming service. And this is for people who are blind, visually impaired, deaf, hard of hearing, deafblind. You can do streaming, or they will mail order DVDs to you. So this is really important. So individuals that love to show Bill Nye science videos, they can go here and actually get them captioned, whereas most of them, the original ones, they were not captioned. So a favorite film that a science teacher has that they don't want to stop using, maybe it's captioned over here. Or they really do need to think about a modification, getting a different video for your student or child. Because if they're sitting there for an hour watching a video that's not accessible, what did they really learn? And maybe it is time to update your media footage, whatever you may be using. Tabby, if we could have the next slide. Okay, this is another thing I know. Thanks. There's a little bit of delay between her and I because we're not in the same place. And I'm moving through a lot of this quite quickly, so I do apologize, but I want to make sure we have time for question and answer. This is another passion of mine. Unfortunately, it's a reality of our world today. Lockdown and secure mode. For those of you that aren't young, you know, like the kids are in school right now, you may have not grown up with this. And this is what does a school do when there's some kind of threat in the community, down the street, or even, you know, at another part of the building. And hopefully you never encounter this, but some of them are just simple lockdowns, so that way everyone's in the classroom and you can load someone up in the ambulance because they fell. So it's not always, you know, tragic, but I just wanted to share this newsletter with you because it really is a good newsletter. It's the Clark Newsletter Fall issue 2015. What is your school doing to make sure when they go into lockdown and everyone's hiding because of something's going on in the building, lights are off, doors are locked, they came over the PA, well, thank you, the public announcement system is not accessible. In my school, we would throw little paper hands underneath the door, so if Johnny was coming back from the bathroom and he saw the hands, he knew where to hide in predetermined and pre-taught locations. So we didn't go from the first emergency to a second emergency where you have a deaf and hard of hearing child hiding somewhere and they don't hear us all clear and they can come out of hiding. So now you're looking for a deaf child that may be scared, and I understand why they may be scared. So this is really critical. Talk to your school. You've got flashing lights for the fire alarms, but public announcement system is not going to be accessible. The interpreter is not going to be with you 24/7, and your personal reference system may or may not pick up that PA. So I talked about the paper cutout. I would also draw an X in the air with my index finger, or if I need it on the student's back, like if I was grabbing them from behind to pull them into the classroom. So that way they knew, all right, this is school staff. Right now we don't have time to talk. I need to move with them. Because I can teach you a sign, but when you're in distress, you're not going to remember that sign 9 months from now or next year. I also had a poster that they could flip out and show the kid we're in lockdown, or the less stressful one, secure mode. And in lockdown in my school, we turn the lights off. So now you've got a dark classroom where if you have a hard of hearing or deaf child that needs visual access, the tap light produced enough light without drawing attention to our classroom. So these are all different tips that you might want to think about as accommodations or modifications to a lockdown secure drill that most people never think about. And we'll leave it there on that one. Field trips and extracurriculars, this is where a lot of coordination between a lot of folks, parents and school and community, has to go hand in hand. And this is for, I'm talking about school-sponsored field trips, extracurriculars, graduation ceremonies for your older sister, yourself, or a family member, you know, whatever. You need to contact the school in advance so they can arrange for the interpreter. And this can take quite a bit of time with all the background work that has to happen. And another example is contacting the community theater for access to their captioning device, their listening device, with a theater interpreter. So that way, you know, your child can have the front row seat and they can see the interpreter instead of being school number 8 all the way up in the balcony. And I would say a school interpreter, in most cases, shouldn't interpret a play at a professional theater because they're not going to have access to the script. They need to be on stage. They need to have the light crew set up lighting. There's so much involved. So the more you know and you can connect people, it's going to be a better field trip. Another thing is, how do you do that accommodation when you're doing a team sport or a competition where there may be local, state, national rules? That gets really tricky if you're going to like a Columbus, our capital, for a convention and a competition. You're going to have to negotiate when does the school interpreter interpret, when does the convention provide their interpreter, and this could be a whole workshop in of itself. But again, which playbook are you playing by? And then we'll go to the next slide. This is just something that I've written up for Section 9 of the IEP. And again, it's about all that collaboration. So I'm just going to read it out real quick. Johnny Smith had the same opportunity as his peers. Whatever he chooses to participate in non-academic extracurricular activities per parent permission for school-sponsored events, this is critical. And he's entitled to an interpreter, but we need at least 48 hours notice so we can call the principal, call the interpreter. If that interpreter can't do it, we can get the next one. And this is really, the time is needed. Once a request has been put in for an interpreter, then we'll communicate back. But if we don't get that RSVP, we're not going to book that interpreter for sure, because we're not going to have an interpreter drive 2 hours for a drama club and have a no-show. So that communication to continue the relationship is really important. So that way you don't burn your bridges, because interpreters are human. At the end of the night, they want to be with their family eating their dinner, but they want to be there to provide access for your child as well. So that is really critical, making sure you RSVP, share when you're going to be there, when you're not, because everyone has issues such as flat tires and that kind of stuff, but the more you can be upfront, it's going to really help in the long run. And this is also the same for personal reference systems, because if it's charged in so-and-so's room, but that door is locked after drama club, and I was in drama club, so I use that example a lot, but it could be softball, basketball, whatever. It's got to be coordinated. How is that FM system going to get back into the room to be charged for the next school day? So there's a lot of dialogue that needs to happen, and this is usually a quickie at the IEP meeting. Most people don't pay attention to the details of this, where I think if you talk up front, you're going to solve a lot of problems and headaches down the road. Tabitha, if we could have the next slide. And these are the resources where I pulled a lot of the information from, and I know we've got a few minutes left, so she's going to take over for the Q&A because we covered a lot of material really fast.
Hi, thank you, Abby. You provided some great information and thorough resources. Thank you so much. I'm going to flip the screen real quick and unmute everybody in case there are questions. Yay. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to go ahead. Okay, wonderful. It sounds like there are no questions today. If you do have any questions that come up afterwards, please feel free to email us, and we can get you in touch with Abby directly if you'd like to talk to her. And just so you know, again, as a reminder, this webinar will be posted online, so you can review it again or share it with your friends if you would like to do that. So thank you for joining us today, and we will look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you, Tabby.
Thank you.